one. All right, so it is my pleasure to introduce, and I won't go through a long introduction and let her, none of the presenters ever like it when we talk a lot about them. So I will just refer to her as longtime friend of the foundation. Allie and her team have been working with the foundation, I believe, for at least 10 years. And she knows many of the nonprofits in our community and has been doing some really amazing work. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce and turn it over to Allie Sterling.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you so much. So happy to be here. I see some familiar faces and new faces, which makes me happy. Yeah, if anyone, we can probably turn the poll off. This was great. I thought it would be an efficient way to be able to get a pulse on, you know, where folks are in the room, the virtual room, if you will. So, and that's usually how it shakes up. A lot of people who already are serving, they're here because maybe they want to improve or enhance their own experience or the experience of their other board members, you know, together collectively. Or some who haven't served yet, but are looking to do so, which is exciting. I sure wish I would have had a training like this before I served on my first board many years ago. That would have been wonderful because I was winging it for a long time and probably could have been far more effective as a board member had I had some training. So I think the neat thing is that, you know, our community foundations, our general learning communities are creating opportunities for this, which just enhances the outcome for both you personally as a board member, collectively as a board, and then I think also really importantly, it raises the profile and the bar, if you will, from a nonprofit perspective. You know, in our work, we see a definite correlation between those organizations who have really high performing boards and that organization's outcomes from a mission delivery perspective and also from a fundraising perspective, right? So I think as we share our time, our talent, and our treasures, we are aligning them much more so today than ever before with organizations that are delivering on those promises and are you know, doing a great job from a leadership perspective, which is what this is all about. So I am going to minimize on my screen that poll, and then and we'll get started. And as Brian said, I really mean this. You know, if you have a question, please go ahead, unmute yourself, ask away. I think that's, you know, how we can get a little closer to that in-person experience is by allowing people to engage during this. And I'm so glad that Brian will be monitoring the chat room and those questions that you might have, because I do a horrible job of that while also presenting. It's like I cannot multitask. So thank you, Brian. Just to move forward here, well, to maybe move forward here. Isn't that funny? Come on. Oh, that's so interesting. It won't move forward on me. Okay. Actually, this is interesting. It's like it froze on my end and won't. Okay. All right. Great. Yay. Good. Phew. No tech problems at all. So this is our firm, and I think, again, I've worked with a few of you, so we're located in Toledo and spend time nationally, but definitely in the tri-state area, and have enjoyed working alongside the Community Foundation team for many years, and their partners in the community. And we'll just go really fast through these and get to the heart of the matter, which is what to expect from Board Member Accelerator. So we call it that because we do think that it does accelerate, you know, your board member experience. Again, we're really looking at it from your personal experience, which is almost most important, because if you are engaged and you are fulfilled through that experience, that is contagious, right, through the rest of the board and then to the organization. So we'll go over an overview of the nonprofit landscape very quickly, just to give everyone kind of a few updates there. We'll spend a lot of time on understanding the board members' purpose and roles and responsibilities. We'll focus a lot on this first session on some of those legal and fiduciary responsibilities, the hardcore ones that are monitored by the Attorney General's office, because I think you have to start with the appreciation of what we actually are legally bound to as board members. As we always joke about, this is a board member, a board engagement, is a different kind of volunteer experience, isn't it? It's not the same as many of us are volunteers with organization. This is a different kind of volunteer. So we'll spend some time understanding and appreciating the differences there. We'll look to see what kinds of signs we should look for in a healthy board and a healthy organization. I'll actually provide you along the way after this session and before the next one, a few documents, checklists, if you will, that you can go through, go take back to the organization that you might already serve on, just to ensure, again, that those boxes can be checked, at least the ones that are important and priority for your organization. So you'll have lots of tools to take back and to use, and some templates to take back and to use. Along the way, if you have any questions for me outside, excuse me, of this session, please let me know. Feel free, excuse me, to reach out as well. We'll learn about this notion of this case for support, the why, essentially, for a nonprofit, why a nonprofit exists, and how they can articulate that in a way focused around board recruitment, and to, again, be able to match up with individuals who have an affinity for your particular nonprofit's mission. We'll challenge some of these assumptions, this notion that a nonprofit has a different playbook in some ways than a for-profit organization as it relates to leadership, as it relates to fundraising or revenue and strategic planning. And I'll offer some ideas around how those are actually more similar than they're different. And we'll actually have a little homework assignment to watch a video that maybe some of you have seen already, but that will be part of our beginning of the next session that we'll talk through those things. We'll discuss a little bit about being a fundraiser, right? And embracing your inner fundraiser. That's something that our organizations need no matter what, is revenue, right? Very similar to a for-profit business, revenue matters a lot. And so being able to be effective and comfortable as a board member and as a fundraiser, which is a very personal thing. I'll speak to that and our philosophy on it, which is really comes from a place of comfort and being custom to who you are. We'll explore your own personal values. We have a couple exercises offline related to this to be able to, just help you, assist you in matching and aligning those values with a mission, whether it be now or in the future. And likewise, how to research and identify what kind of nonprofit board is right for you. And it's not only, the mission, is the mission right for you? It's also at what point in that board experience and the organization's experience, where are they? And we're going to talk about these 3 different modes of governance, all good modes of governance, but depending on where that nonprofit is along that continuum and where you are as far as what kind of board member you want to be, if you want to be really hands-on, or if you can't be really hands-on, you need to know the right kinds of questions to ask an organization to appreciate what stage of governance they're in order to match that up. So we'll talk through that as well. So we'll start out with a little bit on the nonprofit world today, what's happening, what's changing. These are just some fun facts and figures. They're, again, they're fun just to take a look at these, and they're not always exact. They change a lot, but they're, I think, provocative, right, as we consider and go about our day, and whether we're in the boardroom or not. So the first fact and figure here, there's a new nonprofit formed every 15 minutes, according to the IRS. So that's a lot. It's a lot of nonprofits, which means there's an awful lot of competition out there for attention, for board members, for fundraising, you name it. But awful lot of nonprofits. So a new one born every 15 minutes. 10.5% of our workforce, and growing at this point, works for a nonprofit, works in the nonprofit sector. So that's a big change, and that continues. That all these figures are outdated at any minute or moment in time, but you get the sense at least. So that one continues to grow for sure. 72% of us will not make another donation to an organization. So we'll make one donation, but 72% of us don't make a second one, which is kind of difficult, right? When we're trying to create fundraising programs and we're trying to attract new donors. For those of you I've worked with in the past, you'll know that we say, you know, the second donation is the hardest one, right? It's kind of easy sometimes to get someone to donate once to your organization, especially if you're tapping your friends and your colleagues, but how many of us really make a second donation on our own? And so that's where I think the opportunity really lies within our nonprofits, is that second donation. This one won't surprise you. 91% of us actually look to a third party kind of endorsement before we make a donation to a nonprofit. So I think this is probably could be said for anything we do, any purchase we make, right? We all are Googling, you know, best of this and looking at reviews. And so this is just commonplace within our world today. However, I would offer that it's really important that our virtual presence, our website, that, you know, everything that we project in digital media is current and is compelling and persuasive for sure too. Excuse me, the allergies season right now is just killing me. 47% of us, so 47, almost 50% of us will make a purchase of a product or a service that has a charitable component to it over a very similar other one. So think about grocery shopping, think about going to purchase, you know, whatever it is in that grocery store. We'll use yogurt as an example. We will, given two options, very similar, we will pick that one that has some sort of cause marketing surrounding it, some sort of charitable outward expression of a partnership, or, you know, proceeds will go to support this charity. And almost the same percentage, 50% of the time, we will pay more for that product versus another one. So, you know, what does that say to our companies out there? It certainly says that we definitely need to be aligning as a company with the nonprofit sector. Even if it wasn't for altruistic reasons, it just makes good marketing sense because of how we're spending our money and how we're making those decisions, which is very has changed a lot. So our nonprofit sector is really influencing a whole bunch of things that maybe 10 years ago it hadn't. Volunteers are 10 times more, they give 10 times more than non-volunteers. So for those of you who have volunteers within your organizations that you represent, make sure that volunteers are included in fundraising efforts. Sometimes we tend to keep a volunteer siloed, if you will, you know, kind of off to the side because they're doing other work, which is very important, and we don't want to over tap them or, you know, ask them to do, you know, to give money in addition to giving time. But what research shows over and over again is that they give 10 times more than a non-volunteer. They're your most loyal people, right? They've had that experience of your mission firsthand. That's vital and very critical to then the investment that they can make in your mission, especially from a legacy perspective. 16 months, that's, and then again, this number changes, you know, here and there, but that's the turnover rate, unfortunately, of a development director within our sector. So our development staff members turn over every 16 months on average, which definitely causes an awful lot of well, difficulty. Both it's expensive to recruit someone and have them turn over, and then also it's just expensive to find, you know, someone else. And then you have the donor issues of having those relationships started and then that turnover. So we all know what it's like, what turnover is like. And so we're trying hard in our profession and our industry to decrease that, and I should say increase that tenure. And part of that is actually through the board, right? Aligning expectations from a board perspective with what those outcomes should look like for a new fundraiser on a team. So, and more about that a little later. 71% of us will say yes at point of sale to and ask to give some sort of donation. So think about, as we check out at the grocery store or other places, and we're asked if we want to round up, is one of the best examples of this. 71% of us will say yes to that. And I think that's interesting because we also are seeing some shifts in giving. I think, our American population is still extremely charitable, but it doesn't all end up in your bottom line any longer, right? As checks aren't flowing through the mail and into, being deposited as they traditionally were years ago, people are giving in ways that it doesn't, again, it doesn't add up the same way. So if I give at Kroger's, I round up, and that might go to the Kroger Foundation, for instance. And so it's interesting. We're seeing lots of different kinds of trends there, especially even as I was referring to the cause marketing and the products. So I know now we are, purchasing things like Tom's shoes, or you name the company, that will give a donation, of another pair of shoes to another country. And again, there are many different examples of this. So that, I think, makes us feel that we are being charitable, because we're putting our consumer dollars to, we're putting them elsewhere, and we're getting that kind of good return. But that does take away, to some extent, the traditional mode of fundraising that a lot of our nonprofits were really reliant on. And so it's really important as board members to know these facts and figures, and to know where these trends, where they're sticking and where they're not, because they do influence the revenue stream that a nonprofit maybe has had for a long time. And it calls, I think, for us to do a little bit of different kinds of strategies, and create different partnerships and channels, and making sure, again, that our nonprofits are doing that. Finally, the 89% is that 89, so women of baby boomer and older generation give 89% more than their male counterparts, which is interesting. So, and what I think that stat says is we just need to make sure that as our nonprofits are cultivating and soliciting, that we are really talking to all audiences, right? So that's just one example from a gender perspective, but we want to make sure that we are cultivating and soliciting and engaging every other kind of demographic out there, because people are very involved in giving, and we don't want to ever presume that it's just, one person versus the other. So yeah, so just, again, these are meant to be food for thought and provocative a little bit, but also to take these back to our organizations and just make sure where we can, that we are addressing these things and maybe creating new strategies around them. So I'll pause just really quickly in case there's any questions. I'm not a good data person, but if there are any questions or reactions, I'll entertain one or so. Okay, moving on. Just want to make sure that I'm pausing to ask if there are any questions. So I think many of you have seen this. It comes out every year, right? It's coming out like this week maybe, or next week, I think. So that will show 2019 contributions. So here we see, $427 billion last year, highest number so far as giving in the United States. Which is wonderful. I think underneath that are layers of complexity, quite frankly, because we are seeing differences in individual giving. We're seeing a lot of mega gifts, which causes that 68% individuals down there. That figure is getting lower, but it doesn't really mean that people are less charitable at all. It's just that the money, think about the giving pledge, right? Think about Warren Buffett's pledge and everyone who's signing in on that. Well, a lot of funds essentially are coming from a small group of people. So, but the importance of this slide, as a board member who has a responsibility to ensure that the organization is fiscally sound, is financially sustainable from a revenue perspective. So fundraising matters, and what matters, and what's really important, is that we have a strategy in place that is capturing and moving towards those individuals, that component of giving that is most lucrative and effective, which is an individual strategy. So when we look at our nonprofits, sometimes we see this chart, this graph, look different. We see actually where some nonprofits are spending most of their time writing grants to foundations or corporations. And we see this often. So it's actually the opposite. They're spending 70% of their time courting foundations and courting corporations, which is fine to do and have it be a part of that mix. But quite frankly, when we see proof every single year that the majority of donations come from individuals, it's really important that our development programs, that our nonprofits are spending their time and their energy and their strategy on relationships with individuals. So, and that's harder to do. It takes a little bit more vulnerability. A lot of people aren't comfortable fundraising, right? And so it's easier sometimes to write a grant application to a foundation, to write a grant application to a corporation. And those, again, are important things to do, but it's just best and highest use of time tells us statistically year over year that we should be spending a little bit more time with our individuals. So
is this giving, excuse me, is this giving just in the US, or does it include gifts from US citizens to international organizations?
Giving in the US, thanks for, yeah, Clay, just the US. Yeah, good question. And this is our competition I spoke of earlier, right? So we see that continue to have many, many more nonprofits out there. This slide isn't even updated. It's a year out of date, but it continues to grow. We had a dip in the middle due to some reform that caused a lot of nonprofits to kind of go out of business, but that was temporary. And so again, we just want to make sure that we're doing all we can as board members to ensure that our organizations are out there and are being heard, and our messages are as clear as possible, and again, being as strategic as possible. Any questions before we move on to some board fundamentals around role and responsibility? Okie doke. Moving on. So, as I mentioned when I started, it indicated that board members are a different kind of volunteer. It's just not the same as my volunteer experiences in the past. I might be a dog walker at a humane society. I show up, I do my job, and I leave. And I don't have the same kind of responsibilities as a volunteer who serves on a board of that same organization. So I would ask just some input here. How do you think, board members, how do you feel that your board experience might be different, a different kind of volunteer experience? In what ways is it different? Someone has to have one example of how it might be different. What kinds of responsibilities a board member might have that a volunteer does not?
I can answer that. This is Kelly. I feel like being a part of a board, you have an obligation to be out in the community representing your board and promoting everything that your board is doing. It's more ongoing, and should be interwoven into everything that you're doing, as opposed to just a volunteer is, just maybe it's a short time gig and then you move on to something else.
That's excellent. It's a great example of how it's different. Yeah, you're constantly thinking about that organization and promoting that organization. And some volunteers do that actually too, which is kind of cool, but most of the time it's not at the same level. Who else has another thought on that?
Well, the distinction between the board member and volunteers, I guess, would be the board members have a fiduciary responsibility often.
Mm-hmm. Pretty big one too, don't they?
Yeah.
Yeah. We'll definitely talk about the legal differences and those fiduciary ones. Yeah, a typical volunteer doesn't have the weight of a mistake that the organization might make on their shoulders at all. Anyone else have any observations? Any thoughts? Okay, well, here's in our opinion, and there's lots of, answers to this question, but we've kind of boiled it down to these three. So, I mean, they have to be more skilled, right? Usually our boards are recruiting people intentionally to fill a talent or skill set that they need. It might be a communications person, it might be an accountant, it might be legal expertise and experience, it might be program. We all know there's lots of different skills and expertise. So we're looking for that, at more responsibility. So as we've said, and more liability, right? I mean, there's just the responsibility is really comprehensive to the entire organization, and being looking out for it and ensuring, like you would a company, that it's being led, and it's operating in the very best way. And that liability around it is, I guess you could say, the scary part. I mean, in that I always tell people it's not enough to say, well, I didn't know that was happening. Because that's our job as a board member, is to ask the hard questions, right? When something doesn't make sense, or you're curious about something, you really need to speak up and say something. Because to just have not gone to that board meeting when a vote was taken that ended up going badly or not working out, your absence from that board meeting actually, it doesn't hold you harmless in that situation at all. If anything, it shows even more liability for not being an engaged and active board member. So I don't mean to scare people, but it is, it's that's why we have directors and officers insurance, right? And so just going through, the sorts of things, in the conflict that comes up, I swear, maybe, oh gosh, maybe 80% of our inquiries over the last decade from boards that want to, do some sort of work with us, it's usually, the issue is usually some lack of clarity around the purpose that board member had within that organization. So we see that very frequently when something is amiss in an organization. It's just not firing on all cylinders. It's not as optimal as it should be, especially in the boardroom. It's usually that there's some degree of lack of purpose, clarity around the role and responsibilities and it could be because, for whatever reason, when that board member or that certain portion of board members were recruited, maybe the person who was recruiting them just might not have done a full job of talking through those responsibilities. Usually this comes up related to fundraising, right? And I hear often people say, I did not know that I was going to have to fundraise. They didn't tell me that. If anything, they told me the opposite, right? That this is going to be easy. It wasn't going to take as much time, and I wouldn't have to fundraise. We've heard those type of things over and over again. And I think we all know that can't be the case. In most situations, it's not the case. There are situations where fundraising is not needed. So I understand and appreciate that. But in general, it can be. So sometimes we're recruiting people and maybe not being as candid, or maybe we don't even know as we're recruiting what the full purpose of the expectations might be. So getting everyone on the same page there is very important for growth to happen and for movement forward from a mission perspective. So just looking at these key board responsibilities. So they ensure that nonprofits are governed prudently, and that's what today and our next session is about, to just appreciate some of those important must-haves, if you will. Mission aligned. This is tough, right? We know what our missions are, but sometimes, especially in the last 4 months have been a good example of this. Some missions are out of alignment. Some business missions are out of alignment, right? We have businesses who were distilling vodka who are now making hand sanitizer. Interesting, right? And this happens in our nonprofit sector as well, and it doesn't take a pandemic to do that. We find sources of money. We find grant opportunities that sort of kind of fit our mission, and we go after them, right? And then we sometimes get those funds, and all of a sudden, you look backwards 3 years later, and it's like, wait a second, how did we even get in this program area? Why are we even doing this kind of work? This wasn't, the way we started out, and maybe it's for good reason. Maybe those decisions are good decisions, but that mission alignment's a difficult one, and it's a subtle one as well. We need to make sure that our nonprofits have a clear strategic vision. Easier said than done, right? Some of our organizations struggle to have even a strategic plan, let alone a strategic vision for the future. And that's hard to set. It really is, especially today. I feel like we are moving at such a pace, our world moves at such a pace that, you know, people aren't writing 5 to 10-year strategic plans any longer. They're barely writing 3-year strategic plans. We see a lot of 18 to 24 month strategic plans, because that's about as good as we can get sometimes, predicting out into the future. Responsible leadership, you know, that's obvious, right? There is a direct link and cause effect between a successful organization of any kind and a successful leader. And in the nonprofit space, we have a couple different kinds of leaders. We have staff and paid leaders sometimes, and then we have the board. And that board, those are a lot of leaders. It's not just one, you know, advisor. It's, you know, upwards of 10 to 20 people that have to all, you know, individually and collectively be their best selves. Accountable, ethical, of course, and we'll talk through a little bit of some of those baselines that the Attorney General actually sets for us in relation to this. And I also, the email that had 2 attachments, I won't spend a lot of time on that Attorney General piece. The charity, you know, guide to being a board member. That's a wonderful piece. Actually, I've always been surprised. Sometimes those can be very dry, and that's written very well, and it's very easy to read. So I would recommend you taking a look at that when you get a chance. Represent their constituency. So we need to make sure that we are, that our board represents the diversity of our constituency that we serve, and also the broader community. And this is difficult as well. I think we've made good strides to you know, have a more diverse board, but there's a lot of work that we can continue to do related to that. Our sustainable. And sustainable means, you know, oh gosh, someone just said that there was a survey out, and majority of nonprofits in the United States have 3 months, 0 to 3 months of reserves, and that's it. You know, so that doesn't surprise me, because the majority of our nonprofits in the United States have budgets of under $1 million, like 80% have budgets under $1 million. And when you get a little more granular, majority of our nonprofits in our communities and nationally have budgets under $500,000. I mean, most are very micro nonprofits. And so, you know, that notion of sustainable is defined very differently for each organization, but it should mean that the mission's not at risk, and that is, it's difficult to do that. That's why fundraising becomes very important, for sure. And speaking of which, we need to make sure that the resources that we have the sufficient number, the right, you know, kind of resources at any given time, and this can be defined in many different ways. But you look at this, and that is quite a long answer to the question I asked, which is how is a board member different kind of volunteer than a regular volunteer? This right here tells a big story. It's a big job description, but it's an important one, I think, to have that conversation around. So any questions at all? I'll just pause for a moment. All right. So
and Allie, there were some great thoughts in the chat box as well about some of the differences, and a lot of those you actually hit on. So,
hey, that's terrific. See, this group is, they could be teaching it. I love it. I can't wait to look at those comments in the chat box. That's great. Thanks, Brian. So the purpose is to provide for that sustainability and ultimately that growth of the organization, right? Some organizations are intentional. They don't want to grow. They want to just continue as they are. But most any longer really do need to be in a growth mindset because, again, of the competition, both for resources and just awareness, and but mostly for resources, quite frankly. So the way I like to talk through this is that we have a three-legged stool, essentially. So we've used a visual like this before to just describe essentially those components that are very important. And I like to also couch this under this notion of think about your for-profit experience, right? So for those of you who work for a for-profit, who may own their own business, you know, you name it, And when we think about the nonprofit space, we should be thinking similarly. There's really shouldn't be a separate playbook. Somehow, I think the way this plays out is that these things are not as important as the for-profit. We have an issue sometimes with board members, myself included, that I'll go into the board meeting and I may not be paying, I might not be as present as I should be, right? I'm not paying as close of attention. And I'm not always thinking about that organization in the same way I think about my organization sometimes, which isn't good. I should be wearing the same exact hat I have on during the day as I look at the financials of those nonprofits, as I look at the talent, the people, the leadership skills necessary. So I always try to very hard to keep that same lens when I am serving as a board member, because if if something that's not acceptable for my company definitely shouldn't be allowed or excused in a nonprofit space. So from a fundraising perspective, just looking from the left to the right, I mean, that's revenue, right? That's essential. These three things at any given time we may be excelling in, we may be struggling a little bit in, and that's okay. But we need to have, as a board member, we need the pulse of these three things at all the time, at least. So from a revenue perspective, essential, absolutely essential. That is how we turn on the lights in the morning, and it's how we grow to meet that mission that we have, and or well, hopefully not just meet it, but improve and eradicate it, no matter what it is. From a strategy perspective, the similar component within the for-profit space would be a business plan, right? Most of our companies have business plans, and so those really are one and the same. It's also the fiscal operations of an organization, the policies, the procedures, the all behind the scenes sorts of things that make our organizations operate, that cost a lot for our organizations to be effective. We need to invest in those infrastructures. We should be technology, for example, right? Which is something I think recently we've seen investments in technology have really helped us continue to be effective and continue to engage with our constituencies during the time of crisis, which has been great. And so I think we'll see some upticks in appreciation of technology and communication. And then board leadership, this really, the equivalent of this in our for-profit space is just leadership in general, is talent, is people, right? Ensuring that we have succession plans from a board perspective, ensuring that we are recruiting people into our board, that we're orienting them, that we have a best practice around that. We have a system for that, that we are engaging them so they stay in a very, meaningful way. And then again, succession planning might just be team dynamics and development and continuing education, both for staff and for board. So long lists of items underneath these three categories that we won't go into. But again, from a visual perspective and from my personal experience, when I look at my nonprofit roles that I have, I try very hard to be keeping these three things always in the forefront of my mind as I'm considering, how effective I can be and how I can contribute, to that organization. So how do we fulfill our purpose? So there's that nutshell of it being this three-legged stool, but how does that play out? And I'm gonna pull up some discussion points and just actually let's do this here. So how do we communicate purpose to board members? So what does this look like live and in person? How, for those of you who have our board members and or might be nonprofit executives, because I think we have a couple that are joining us today as well, love to know just how do we communicate purpose to our board members? And I mean their purpose, like really what their purpose is. Any thoughts or ideas or experiences to share? Well, a couple easy ways, and we're going to give you some tools that you can use after our sessions to maybe take a look to see if these things need to be updated from your personal space within the nonprofits you're serving on or considering serving on, but they would be a job description, right? So I think, you know, when we think about our work in the for-profit arena, when I take a job, I want to know what it's expected of me to do. And it's really nice when it's in writing. That's always very helpful. So that is one thing and one way that we can communicate purpose to our board members is as we recruit board members, we actually have a document that goes over what those unique responsibilities are. So the basic ones, yes, the ones that, again, the Attorney General requires of us, but also unique to the organization, what kinds of ways do we expect our board members to provide for us? So that's one way. Orientation, you know, I think so many of you do a great job of orienting your boards to the organization, and that's another way, right, with a really comprehensive orientation, and one that isn't just a one-time, but it's really something that's continuous. You may infuse in your board meetings, you know, purpose every single board meeting, and I've heard so many great stories of how people do this, which I think continues then to have people wanting more. They want to come back for more, right? So that's just, again, two different ways that we communicate purpose, and we'll give you some tools to go back and maybe, you know, take a look at your current job description for your board members, and maybe there's a couple ways to enhance it or to make some changes to it. So that's just a couple ways. And so the next thing would be, you know, how do boards fulfill the three legs of the stool? So how do our boards and our board members actually make good on those three different areas and feel like, you know, they're contributing in a way that matters, and without micromanaging, of course, right? We don't want our board members to be doing the work of staff and getting too in the weeds, but how might this play out from a board perspective? Any thoughts?
Again, we see the chat box blowing up with the first point we still have. We'll give folks a second to respond to the second question, but the first question, through a board member expectation metric, bylaws and policies, orientations, mission statements, board retreat, a lot of the things that you had mentioned. It's
great. Those are really good examples, yeah. And related to the second question, and there's lots of answers here for sure, but if you think about your committee structure, right? That gives an opportunity for board members to walk alongside staff, or in the situation where an organization doesn't have staff, it allows board members to play that role until maybe that organization gets big enough to have staff members. And so the committee work and how we design our committees is where we really can fulfill some of the aspects of fundraising strategy, and then the, you know, board leadership, the personnel, the governance, the all the other things that fall into that big bucket. And here's a real important one that comes up an awful lot, which is, you know, how do we build a constructive partnership between board member and executive director? This is where we see, when we see turnover, maybe turnover too much in a board, or we see evaluations that are not as excellent as they should be, it usually is as a result of you know, something gone awry maybe in the relationship between the executive director and maybe that board chair or an executive committee, et cetera. And so it is just so essential that our executive directors and our board members find a way, and it's different for each organization, to have a powerful and a respectful relationship where they know that they have the support of those board members. Those board members appreciate their role, which we're going to get to in another second, just about what, you know, what is the role, what isn't the role as it relates to that constructive partnership. And it, you know, it usually goes back to a communication standard and a communication structure. So some of the best constructive partnerships are ones where, like, that board chair and that executive director either a touching base, every Friday. It might be every 2 weeks, but it is a definite check-in. There's just that kind of hardwired expectation both ways. And when we don't have those kinds of hardwired, communication stops, what we find is, well, we all get really busy, don't we? And, it's a haphazard approach never really works very well. And then before you know it, you're rushing right before an executive committee meeting or board meeting to get a few minutes of your board president's time to be able to go over that agenda, and everything's rushed and it's just not as thoughtful and as intentional as it could be. So and I think that a lot of executive directors and a lot of the ones I've worked with within the Findlay community do a great job of communicating out to their full boards, in a way that they really feel that they're giving everyone the highlights, while not spending maybe too much time looking back, because we want to spend more time looking forward, right? We want to use our board meetings that way. So Brian, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in the chat space?
So again, very similar. Miley set expectations when recruiting a board member to make sure what that member is recruited to bring to the nonprofit board. Everybody has a clear set of job requirements. It's about, with the relationship, that idea of clear responsibilities and meeting the director outside of meetings so that you have a good working relationship, and communication is so critical.
That simple statement of meeting outside of the board meetings takes coordination. It takes, planned, appointments, but it's so valuable. It really is priceless, because you really get to know not only that board chair, but you get to, if you do that with all of your board members and get on a routine of doing that, it really pays back, and yields greatly. So, what are some of the things boards should and should not be engaged in? And we're going to just go to the next slide on this, because you'll see just kind of a short, high level sort of thing. But boards on the left-hand side, they should be involved in governance, right? That is the role of the board. They are actually in charge at the end of the day. Planning, strategic and otherwise. So certainly, working alongside a team, to create that strategic plan, which again, totally depends on the size of your organization. Sometimes board members are creating the strategic plan because they don't, there's no paid staff. And I get that. And as we talk through that evolution from a governance perspective, that continuum, we see where as organizations get bigger, they have more staff lead in those ways, and board members support and endorse, it differently, again, as we evolve as organizations. Policy, definitely, those are the really important pieces of all of this, that policies matter at the end of the day more than many things, and we've seen that play out, interestingly, in the last few months. Evaluation. So evaluation is critical. If I can impress on everyone only one takeaway from the entire board member accelerator is to do your evaluations. Make sure that you are evaluating your own performance, your board's performance, and if you have paid staff, that CEO or that executive director. So we recommend 4 different evaluations. And so the first one is a full board evaluation, right? So the board is reviewing its own performance collectively. And through that job description, it's pretty easy to know if, collectively we've done that work or not. So that's the first one. The second one is your own personal board evaluation. So just, again, yourself, it's something that doesn't get turned in necessarily, but just, and we have tools and templates for you on this, and we'll make sure we send some of those out and give those to Brian. But, just a reflection of how did I do as an individual? I set out, no one sets out to not be a great board member, right? But stuff happens, life happens, work happens, changes, come up, and we have an opportunity then to go, ooh, I missed a lot of board meetings, and as it turns out, I'm looking ahead, and I'm going to have to miss a few more. Maybe I need to have a conversation with, with someone, with the governance chair or with whoever would be appropriate, and speak to that, speak to how that is. something that I worry about and I don't want to model. And I'll use myself in this situation. I once had to go off of a board because I felt I was modeling poor behavior. And here I am, a board governance consultant, and I'm missing meetings, and that just doesn't look good. And there were things outside of my control, but they were going to continue to happen. So and that pause, that evaluation really caused me to evaluate myself and have a proactive conversation before I had to have anyone come after me and to have that ugly conversation. So, and then the third would be to make sure that we are evaluating our paid staff member, our leader. If you have one, if you've got an executive director, CEO, or whatever the title might be, you have to give that person an evaluation once a year at a minimum. And some organizations do, spot checks every 90 days, every quarter check-ins, which is even better. And it's critical. We do not do a good job of this at all. And we really shouldn't have our staff member coming to us to ask for a performance evaluation. That's how we live and breathe, right? Is to know how we're doing against what the expectations were. And so that's the third. And the last one we recommend is an evaluation of the board meeting itself. Don't have to do this every time, but you should be doing it a few times a year, just to a quick survey, Survey Monkey after the board meeting to say, how'd we do? What did you like about the board meeting? What didn't you like about the board meeting? What could we do differently? Really basic questions will elicit any issues that are happening. Data shows that the reason a lot of individuals go off of a board or stop attending is because they don't like something in the meeting. And I think we've all been there before, right? Either the meeting's gone too long, continuously, the agenda, no one sticks to the agenda. There's some, maybe unconstructive behaviors that are happening in the boardroom. There's, that kind of a board profile of someone who's, kind of talking all the time, or taking things off of track. I think we all appreciate what these things are, but we don't often evaluate the board meeting. And when we do that and we get that constructive and respectful feedback, we can make changes then to correct for those things, so we don't have people who don't come, and who ultimately not only don't come and then drop off the board, but then they don't have a good feeling and experience. And that experience matters a lot, especially as it relates to their ability to be an ambassador in the community, and a fundraiser as well. So the other aspects here should be involved in, right, advocacy, the why, knowing, what that messaging looks like, and again, high level kinds of stuff, financial health, budgeting, fundraising, other kinds of oversight. On the other side, what they should not be involved in would be the day-to-day operations. Now, I say this with a big disclaimer, right, because as organizations start, and they're young, board members do sometimes play these roles, right? And the goal is that they work themselves out of a job, right? This is not the way that we should be forever. In the beginning, sometimes it happens, and then again, the goal is that we are emerging and evolving from a strategy and a governance perspective to where we are hiring staff, and then the board member goes back to what their role really is. We should not be involved in personnel decisions, right? Program decisions, the stuff that, again, your team, your staff are definitely the ones who have the skills and expertise to do. Criticizing the organization publicly. It's surprising, you wouldn't think you had to, put this up here, but we do find people forget that they can't actually represent the organization in any political ways, or really any formal ways like that at all. You're not really representing the organization. And everyone should have a great, protocol for this, and who may be a go-to person on the board who can, alongside, that executive director, actually represent the organization. Parking lot meetings, we've all been there. If we have something that's bothering us, or question, or something we don't understand, we really should raise our hand and ask that question, and feel safe to do that in a board meeting, not in the parking lot afterwards. So first of all, there's probably other people that are asking the same question and wondering the same thing, and it would be beneficial to have that kind of conversation with everyone, right? And then I sort of also address the representing the organization already. So I'll stop there and see, Brian, if there are questions or any thoughts in regards to this slide.
One thought was just that the executive director needs to have the key responsibility and always considering the volunteer chair as decisions are made, so that not to inadvertently straddle somebody with needing to recruit a bunch of volunteers for something.
Oh, yeah. Sure. Yeah. Good observation. Any? Okay, we'll move on. All right. So what exactly does governance mean? It's just that word, you know, we use it all the time, and it sounds kind of heavy-handed. I suppose it is. I think the actual definition is got the word control in it, and but it's really leadership. I mean, it's like anything else. You know, how we create the best framework for how we work and how we execute our mission and that structure, and is really all about leadership and making some difficult decisions often, but knowing how to lead and knowing when to lead as well. So this visual is a critical one in our board governance work and our board trainings. And what it's doing is it's showing three different kind of phases of governance, right? So there's the fiduciary, the strategic, and the generative. And we'll go in depth on this, but just from a framework perspective, organizations can go through all three of these. They can actually operate in all three of these at the same time. Many of our organizations actually, most of them, never really leave the fiduciary mode of governance because, as I said earlier, most of our nonprofits out there are very, very small nonprofits, right? And so it's very difficult, just like small businesses, it's hardest, you know, in the beginning, right? It's hardest when you're small and starting up. And that fiduciary is really all about the basics, paying the bills and making sure that you've, you know, got the fundamentals, the check boxes, you know, done there. And moving out of that really does take staffing. It takes, you know, a bigger budget. It takes more fundraising. It takes leadership that isn't just board, but that is then complemented by staff to move into these other two phases of governance. And we'll walk through what those are. But I just, as a framework, you can be in all of them, but most of our nonprofits really are squarely in that fiduciary mode of governance, and most of them don't actually leave that stage. So just as a backdrop. So when we think about that first, that fiduciary mode, you really are, I mean, you're stewarding the assets. You're making sure that when, one example is someone gives you $10, that it's received, it's recognized, it goes into the right account. And if it's earmarked to be used for something specific, it's earmarked to be used that, and that's how it's deployed. Really overseeing those operations, ensuring the appropriate use of resources so that we are, again, you know, operating in a healthy, safe way, and we aren't egregiously overlooking things that are fundamental to really keeping our 501c3 status, right? Submitting the reports that are necessary, complying with the letter of the law. And so that's the legal compliance and that fiscal accountability as well. And so a little deeper here, and I think this is where, you know, we should spend a little bit of extra time. The Attorney General and each state, by the way, has a little different variation on this, but not by much. But ours, in Ohio at least, there are these 4 fundamental legal responsibilities that a board member has. So in addition to the ones that are more customized for your unique mission, like maybe a fundraising, you know, expectation, or a, you know, committee differences, et cetera. These are the basic and most important ones as far as what we need our board members to know, and to know how this plays out. And I think this is the area that we really spend the least amount of time in when we're recruiting and when we're orienting and when we're evaluating our board members. So this is where I also will leave a little bit, and I'll look down at my notes because there's always so much here. But you know, and where the Attorney General comes into play is that they actually have to ensure that your mission and the reasons it was granted that 501c3, that you are actually doing always in benefit for your constituency. So that is the most important thing to the Attorney General. Actually, it's one of the first things that the Attorney General offices nationally were responsible for even a century ago. So it's been a long-standing practice of Attorney Generals. And it doesn't matter if your organization is a $100,000 budget organization or if it is a $100 million organization. The same thresholds apply for each of those. So we look at the first one, the duty of care. So this is one that's interesting. I think, this is, they need to, your board members must conduct themselves in the same way as I shared with you, as I would, conduct myself with my business. I need to apply that same level of acumen and expectation and performance when I'm serving as a nonprofit board member as well. So I think that's a very critical piece to not overlook. So that means essentially we need to attend board meetings, which I know sounds silly, and it's hard to often, but we have to make sure that, through how we execute this is through being present and engaged in the board setting. So actually, and even reading those board meeting minutes and the reports and all the packet information, that's how this gets carried out. So we need to ask questions when there is one. So it's actually an obligation we have. If we have a question or we're concerned or confused about something, we really need to bring it up in the board meeting. And again, as we know, there's probably someone else who probably has that same question or confusion as well. So that's another way this plays out. This also plays out from a duty of care perspective of those evaluations. So by having an evaluation structure in place that you can indicate that you do every year, like clockwork or close to clockwork, that's how we evidence that we are in compliance with that duty to care. The independent judgment is another component of this. So we have to be able to show that we've acted independently when we make those decisions, that we don't have conflicts, and we'll get into that conflict of interest piece here in a second with the next duty, but that's an important one. And then we need to make sure that we are setting policies, and not just setting them, but that we're actually reviewing them, making sure that they are updated, making sure that they are current, and accurate, and that things haven't changed enough that we should be updating those policies. So it's really a lot of policy review. And again, the expectation is that, there's only one position that we as board members supervise, and that is of the executive director. So we need to evidence that we have carefully done that we have provided that support through a performance evaluation, through any other kinds of leadership, support that they need. So duty of care, and as I mentioned, I always look at this as if I was running a company, or if this was my company, can I say that I did what I felt should be done, and for those reasons? How often can I say that? Because not going to meetings or being not present if you're even in the meeting and taking a look at a whole bunch of other things, which I'm guilty of sometimes, unfortunately is not a defense if something goes really wrong with the organization. So which we hope that doesn't happen. But so that's duty of care, and so that's kind of one of the heavier ones, if you will. They're all four more sort of heavy. Duty of loyalty. So this is, as I mentioned, we need to make sure that we don't have any conflicts of interest, or if we do have a conflict of interest, that we are simply indicating what that is and being honest about it. Because, for example, I can think of one board I served on where we were going to blacktop, the parking lot, and one of our board members owned a company that did that, right? So it's a great situation where that individual ended up actually doing that work, but we made sure that we did get other proposals from 2 or 3 additional companies, and then we made that decision, and they did not take part in that decision. So it doesn't mean that you can't overcome a conflict of interest, but we just have to make sure that we're disclosing those, because as we know, perception is reality, right? And so the last thing we want to do is find out that there was some sort of conflict that wasn't disclosed, that then comes out in the paper or something like that, and we've all seen all of those things happen. So the question is, who really is benefiting from a decision? If I'm personally benefiting from something, that's where you've got a conflict and just need to disclose it. So duty of loyalty. Duty of compliance, here, you know, we have this duty to be faithful to the organization's purpose and mission, which sounds and seems kind of easy, but it is, it can be harder to do sometimes. And this is also that, yeah, I like to think of it as ignorance is not bliss, right? Just because we didn't know something, or we didn't ask those questions, or we didn't think to ask a question, like, for example, where's the 990 filed? When we make the assumption that it's been done and no one actually shares that it has been done, that's right there. We have to know, and the person who's responsible for that, whether it's the finance committee or whether it's the staff member, and combined, actually there's responsibility. We just need to share that those things that are most important to maintaining our exempt status and to maintaining our mission, most importantly, are actually executed. So, this is also gets into the letters of incorporation, into the bylaws, right? You know, are those things, are we acting consistent to what's on paper? And I think it's frequent that, you know, when we look at those bylaws, sometimes they're out of date. I mean, we might have committees that weren't even written into the bylaws, or we might not have a committee in place that was in the bylaw. So these things can be changed. There's strategies around this. Is that, you know, that one example, it's an easy one. Just don't write in a ton of different committees, right? Write in just the essential ones, and then you have that flexibility. But just ensuring that those policies, procedures, those really important components like reporting and returns and, you know, articles of incorporation, that there's alignment, and that we're familiar with what those must have and needed things are on an annual basis. So, so let's see here. The next one, a duty to maintain accounts. So, you know, here we have everything from, do we have a budget? And we need a budget, right? Do we have a strategic plan? Do we have a fundraising plan? These are aspects that are really important. If they mean that your organization is going to be financially, that's how you evidence stability and accountability, then we need to make sure that we have those things in place. I have written down here, because I forget, leaving nothing to chance, right? So making sure that we are not assuming anything again. We're not in that kind of mode. Board minutes, another thing too, accurate records. So financially, whoever's responsible for bookkeeping, etc., that goes into this as well. And then again, like I said, the board minutes are very important, needing to make sure we take those. So I'm going to pause here and see, Brian, if there are some thoughts and reactions that people had. I'm also going to shut my front door because the mowing crew came to my neighbor's house. And so I'm going to shut my front door. Anyway, yeah, Brian, let's see if there's any reactions or thoughts and questions.
So far, nothing has shown up on the chat box, but feel free to unmute yourself and share if you have thoughts on these.
And they're kind of downers a little bit, right? But I think they're really important. They're like the most important things to just know. It just goes right back to the difference between a board member and a regular volunteer who shows up and goes home.
I don't really, this is Miley Doyle, and I don't think we can ever not spend the amount of time necessary to orient board members about these responsibilities. I think they come into a board for very different reasons, but we need to make sure that board members understand that for the time they're serving, whatever their term is, they are the owners of this organization. And just as in the very beginning you stated that we need to be in duty of care, what would we do if it were our business? Well, it is our business.
No, thank you for that, underscoring that. I really appreciate it. I know in the boards that I serve on and have served on, I don't know any of them who actually went through this stuff with even a higher level. I mean, this is, and I think people either they assume that folks know this, I guess. And I didn't, you know, especially going back to some of my first board roles, I had no idea about this. I was just excited and everyone's excited, right? And it's just excitement. And it's like, no, there's a lot of other things that go on. So I agree with you. I think we have a real opportunity to, in the recruitment phase, maybe, but definitely in the orientation phase, and maybe even from an annual perspective, maybe there's, again, a pause at an annual meeting or some, some frequency that's built into where we can look at this and say, yes, 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 yes. We feel pretty darn good that we are measuring up well. So yeah, I agree with you. Okay. So why move beyond fiduciary? So remember, those 4 duties are all under the fiduciary umbrella. So that's just where it starts. And as we look to move into more of a strategic mode of governance, which is where we want to get, because we want to move out of just, that the basic role of a board member, right? And we want to move into where a board member can feel aspirational. And they feel that really their contributions aren't just checking boxes, but they are really lending their talent and their experience and their passion in a way that is transformational. That's how we want to move, and that's why we need to move past the fiduciary and into the strategic mode, which really here, you're serving more as I look at it as you're serving more as an advisor, because that all of those other things are really in place. You're being reassured of those things every year. So I no longer am worried about those things. There's a committee that's making sure of that. And now I get to use my particular talent and expertise. And let's say it's in fundraising or it's in having a small business. And I get to work alongside staff, to be creative and to be innovative. And again, not overstepping anyone, but when asked, be able to be a thought partner. And you're making major decisions. You're deciding, gosh, do we need to stop a program, right? Like it's not just growing stuff. And let me tell you, it's far more difficult sometimes, far more brave to say no to things that you're doing already than it is to add things additionally, right? And so that in itself can be an incredible value of being in a strategic mindset and mode. So, and then why move to generative? And it's because that generative, and we'll get to that in a second, but definitely our world changes all the time. I mean, daily, and the pace has quickened so much as well too. And so often, those first 2 are really truly, and most just to get to strategic mindset and mode of governance is a major coup, as I said, because most don't move into that. But when we look at generative, then we're really looking at that pure leadership role, right? I mean, this is what I like to compare these 3 modes to, and this might be helpful because the generative one's always a little tricky to understand. I look at it as this. Think about, buying a car, right? And so you're buying your first car, you're excited, you want any car, doesn't matter, you want a car because you need to get around. That's fiduciary. You just need to get from point A to point B in life. Strategic mode of governance then is you decide after a few years or whatever that you're going to buy a Prius or you're going to buy a hybrid car because you recognize that it's not enough to just get from point A to B, but you also don't want to damage the environment. You want to be able to take your money, your time, and create a better planet, a better future, you name it, right? So you're really intentional in the strategic phase of your life or in governance. And then in generative, you might decide, you know what? I'm not going to have a car. I'm going to take public transportation because that's actually the most responsible thing to do. And that takes a lot of sacrifice on my part, but it is truly, if we're going to, move the needle and we're going to make change happen, that is the biggest decision from a leadership perspective that I could personally take. So I always use that car analogy because it's helpful. So generative, while it's good and it's a wonderful thing that a lot of very sophisticated organizations, think museums, think healthcare organizations, those board members are truly there for incredibly to be challenging to each other, to be provocative, to be disruptive, quite frankly, to take that organization and catapult it in ways that are very different than of the role of a board member in a fiduciary organization. There are problems with generative mode. However, it's not all rosy. Sometimes not getting here is okay, because we hear from feedback from board members who serve on organizations boards that are in the generative mode, that they don't know what their purpose is, oddly enough. They are almost not necessary, because, you know, think about a healthcare system, think about a museum. Those organizations have top-notch staff, right? I mean, they are doing everything. They're creating strategy, they're executing strategy, and they're doing so in an incredible way, to where you can run the risk of your board member going, I need a little bit more engagement. Like I need to feel that I'm making an imprint on this organization differently. So there are risks associated with essentially working your board member out of a job, if you will. But anyway, I share that just as, you know, these three modes are very important as we think about not only how we want our organizations to be and progress through, but also when we're looking to join a board. As you can only imagine, the board experience at the fiduciary level versus the strategic versus the generative is very different. So if you're an individual who really wants to like get their fingers dirty, roll up their sleeves, be really involved, maybe because you have more time, maybe it's you've retired, and you know, name the scenario, you might want to be in an organization that's more in a fiduciary mode of governance, because they really need you in a very different way. Conversely, you might be an individual who doesn't have any time, would love to be a thought partner with an organization, but that's about it. And so it might be that you might want to stay away from a nonprofit that is in more of a fiduciary mode. So anyway, food for thought. And I'll pause, Brian, we're winding up here. So I'm going to pause and see if there are any questions or comments on this, and then we'll move to closing session 1.
No, somebody messaged me privately to make sure they'd get a copy of the PowerPoint. So I want to make sure we point that out, that everybody will. We might do it 2 sections or once at the very end. Allie will take the lead on that one. But the thing that I think is really interesting is, so when I think about what makes the difference for me between a nonprofit board and volunteering, it's I am much pickier with the organizations that I choose to be a board member of than I am for the ones that I volunteer. And one of those reasons is because the commitment is so much bigger. And when we look at all of these different responsibilities, and especially building off of that idea of it's okay to be choosy, because you want to make sure it's a match on both sides. And I know you're going to talk about this in the second part. It's not just finding a person for a board seat, but it's making sure it's a match between what I'm willing to provide and what they need. And I've been on boards in different parts of this mode of governance at different points in my life, and it's helped me be more clear in what I'm looking for with board service at different stages. And I know we're going to talk about that at the next section, but I think it's interesting food for thought to tee up next week.
Yeah. Thank you for that. You're so right. And I think it explains, Brian, and everyone else, it explains how people can get frustrated serving on boards. And then it wasn't the intention for it to happen that way. You know, we're recruiting people. We're not even self-aware sometimes as to what, and you can call this whatever you want. You can use other words for this. These are our words. These are our, you know, thoughts here. But when we don't recognize that we're in, as an organization, this fiduciary stage, and we're recruiting someone who really probably wants nothing to do with that, but we're not saying it because we don't even recognize it ourselves. We get someone to join because they know someone else who's on the board, and they're like, oh, sure, great. And then they get frustrated because they're not feeling useful. You know, they really feel like it was going to be one experience in their mind, and it's not. And again, no harm, no foul on both sides. It's just communication and clarity and awareness of who you are as an organization and who you are as a board member, and what your capacity is critical for that alignment. So yeah, and we will spend more time on that next section as well. So we're going to spend more time on this. I'm going to pull all of these up. You have a document which also goes over this in more detail, and I'm going to save this a fuller conversation because there's an awful lot of really exciting things in here. But this is kind of this model, which I will tell you, if you're any board you're on and any issues that are occurring, you can solve for whatever that issue is by going to this and seeing where something is amiss, right? Because it's usually some issue either, you know, from a architecture perspective, which all this means is that you've got the right board members, that you're constantly looking at that mix. You know, coming up in 1 year and 2 year, who's going off. So you know you're going to have, you're not going to have a legal person on your board in 2 years. Well, you should be starting now replacing that person, because one, it takes time to find the right person, and two, you want that person on board. If there can be overlap with the person who's terming off, you want the overlap, right? So like that, just really clarity around succession and strategic pipeline, and always have a waiting list. Your goal should be that your board has a waiting list. How does that sound, right? That sounds pretty good. It's the complete opposite of the way we sometimes present ourselves, which is like, please, 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 you know, I will make this the easiest board seat you've ever had. I'll promise you all sorts of things that we should never be promising people, because we can't deliver on them, nor should we. But we should have a waiting list. And that sends a very different message to the kind of people that you want. So we'll walk through this stuff next session, but there is a way through appreciating these 5 things to diagnose and even be proactive in ensuring you don't get into a situation, but definitely diagnosing where something has gone wrong. And I'll spend more time on that definitely next time. So, but I wanted to show it to you. I wanted you to take a look at the handout because it's a little bit more thorough. Our website has a little bit more stuff on this too, but so I'm gonna turn over to this homework and prep for session number 2, and then we'll have a couple minutes for questions if there are any. So homework for next session, many of you may have seen Dan Pallotta's video. And, you know, if you have, just watch it again, right? I've watched it like, I don't even know. Brian, how many times have you watched this video?
At least a dozen or 2, maybe.
And like every time, don't you get something else out of it?
Yeah, every time it reminds me of why he's one of my favorite speakers on this topic.
Absolutely, absolutely. So me too, and I think I've seen it maybe like 40 or 50 times potentially. So, so watch this. I will send Brian the this PowerPoint deck, the slide deck, when we get done here, so that way he can get this out to you, so you have everything that we went over today, and you also have a reminder of the link to this, and you can just simply Google it and it will come up regardless, and so it doesn't take much to find it. So watch it, and then think about these questions when you are when you're watching it and afterwards, right? So this notion of should nonprofits be run like businesses? Why or why not? How could a board member internally become a bit of a catalyst, you know, to change maybe a mindset around thinking differently? Yeah, what was your biggest aha? So we'll start out the next session just with some comments around this. I would really like for everyone maybe to just, if only that last one, what was your biggest aha? Maybe we'll start a chat earlier, and Brian, we can read some of them off, you know, when people join. So that could be fun. And then we'll talk through, again, some of these things, the leftovers that we didn't get to today, and even more. So there's a lot of really great templates and some exercises. I'll try to create maybe one of those exercises during our session. This is where video does kind of not do the best job as in person, but we can simulate some of it, and then the rest of it you can take back. And a lot of it's personal stuff anyway that a lot of people like to reflect on their own anyway. So yeah, anyway, so that wraps up for me, the content for today. Any questions that anyone has, or any waiting there in the chat queue, Brian?
There are no questions in the chat. We just had a statement, I'm not sure I want to watch an infamous talk. No pressure to have the aha moments. I have some closing comments, though, if nobody else has questions first. I'll give it another minute, and we'll revisit it after the final question or final thoughts. A huge thank you to Allie. Something that many of you might be aware of, but some might not. We provide as a foundation individual coaching for nonprofit organizations that are free of charge, and each nonprofit can sign up to be with the coach 4 times a year. And Allie's team is one of those coaches. And so they are at the foundation now virtually multiple times per year. So if you want more information on those coaching sessions, please let me know. In addition, after these 2 sessions in the fall, we have another series where we're going to talk about board service as well. So I know I've gotten some messages during this about how they can share the message with the right language, with the right verbiage. So Allie and I can talk, and maybe at the next session, we can talk at the end about what we'll cover in the fall. In case folks, it might change how they want to participate in the fall. And then finally, I'll do a survey after both of these sessions. Believe it or not, we start planning about 6 months in advance. So in July, I start planning the curriculum for 2021. So when you get the link, please don't delete it. Try to fill it out to help us provide the best offerings as possible for 2021. And with that, thank you all for taking time out of your Tuesday to be with us on a beautiful sunny day. And thank you, Allie, and your team.
You're welcome. My honor. It's so much fun to be here. Thanks everyone for being part of this. Looking forward to the next one.
All right. Thank you all. Have a good day.